What's the difference between Next.js and React? Well, that's what you'll learn in this course from Ankita Kulkarni. She helps developers level up their careers, and she'll help you level up in this course.
Next.js is a framework versus React is a library. You can't necessarily compare the two as it's not apples to apples comparison. But you may always wonder, what would life look like without a framework? What does a framework provide? And should you go with a framework or not? So in this specific course, you will learn Next.js and the power that it provides us as it is a framework, and compare that to React alongside Vite, and Vite is a really powerful front-end tool. Towards the end of this course, you will learn what the difference between a framework and a library is. You will learn different data fetching mechanisms and knowing which one to pick for your project and for your page. You will learn different rendering strategies. You will learn how to build a performant app and what goes behind the scenes of building a performant app. You will also learn search engine optimization, which is SEO, and also how should you get started with learning React. All of this will be covered in this specific video. Along the way, you will also pick up skills with Tailwind CSS and also shadcn UI library, which is getting really popular these days, alongside learning complex topics in depth in React, Vite, and Next.js. Everything that you need is right here, and I will be walking you through each step one by one. So what are you waiting for? Let's get started. Now, if you are interested in following along and getting all the visuals as well as all the links that I have shared in this specific course, then check out this specific link. This is essentially a cheat sheet and a visual explanation of all the key Next.js, React, and Vite concepts that I'm sharing in this specific course. So if you are interested, then check out the link in the description or as a pinned comment for downloading the specific cheat sheet. Now, this cheat sheet is really good. It has all the visuals and links that I've shared in this specific course alongside GitHub commits, so you can follow along as I teach this course. So check out if you're interested. Now, whenever you're ready to level up your Next.js skills, I have some good news. I'm running a exclusive hands-on workshop for you to take your Next.js knowledge to the next level. It will teach you everything that you need to know to design, build, and deploy a full-stack app with Next.js. It is a live workshop, so you will get direct access to me, and I will answer any questions that you may have as well. Plus, at the same time, you will get lots of exercises to learn different topics in Next.js. You will be divided into breakout rooms so you can learn from your workshop peers as well and learn complex topics together. And if you get stuck, don't worry, because I'm there to help guide you as well. Additionally, you can show off your certificate of completion at your workplace or on LinkedIn to showcase that are a certified Next.js developer. At the same time, I will be sharing a lot that I couldn't necessarily share in this specific crash course in that workshop. So if you're interested, please sign up to the waitlist, as the waitlist folks get exclusive launch discounts and special bonuses as well. So sign up to the waitlist and I will see you in the workshop. So first, let's try to understand the difference between a library and a framework. Now, what exactly is a library versus a framework? This specific visual really does a great job at describing what a library does, and so does a framework. Now, library and framework both are reusable pieces of code. A framework will provide the overall structure, a skeleton for your application, versus a library is going to provide you reusable pieces that you can utilize and use your creativity to do whatever you want. Using the analogy of Legos, on the left hand side, a library is like a box of assorted Lego pieces without any specific instructions. So as you can see here, they're trying to figure out what exactly they can do using their creativity. They have the full freedom to use the Lego pieces to create whatever model they like. They can use whatever custom designs as per their needs. But on the right hand side, versus a framework is like a Lego set with a predefined model of instructions. You follow the instructions, what's on the box, and create whatever you want to create. Now, there is little customizations in a framework, but because the instructions are so clear, you know exactly what you need to do. On the right hand side in a framework, you're going to think less about a lot of the details in your application. On the right hand side in the framework, a lot of the hard decisions are made for you, so you don't have to worry about making those decisions yourself. Versus on the left hand side in the library, you do have to make those decisions yourself, which can be harder depending on your application. So in our case, Next.js is a framework versus React is a library. So Next.js gives you a lot out of the box, such as built-in routing, different data fetching mechanisms, really rich metadata API for search engine optimization, and a lot more. So you just use those specific APIs and customize and build your application. Versus React is a library. So we need something called as Vite alongside React so that we can compare the two. That is creating a React application with Vite versus with Next.js, which is a framework. And we will talk about that in depth a bit later as well. But this is what the difference between a library and a framework is. So what exactly is React versus Next.js? Well, React is a really popular library built by Facebook. It is a library for not just the web, but also for building native user interfaces. If you want to build a mobile app, you can definitely do that with React using React Native. React has definitely onboarded many developers because the development is so much easier and faster because of React. With React, you can create the UI, that is user interfaces. If you are familiar with other programming languages, then you can think of React as a view layer. Whatever gets displayed to the user is what we'll be using React for. You can create different user interfaces from a concept called as components. And components are essentially individual repeatable pieces that combine together and are known as components. For example, in this case, thumbnail is a component, like button is a component. But a component can also comprise of different components, and we can combine them all together to form different screens and pages and so on. Now, React lets you build seamless applications, and that is also a reason why Next.js is in fact built on top of React. Now, you can write components with different code, and React has a special rendering mechanism to know when exactly to update what part of the UI. So React is pretty amazing. On the other hand, Next.js is in fact a React framework for the web. It is a framework that is built on top of React. I also like to say it's the production framework for React, and you will learn why in a bit. Now, Next.js is a full stack framework. So just like we talked about how React is the view layer, Next.js not just allows us to build the front end, but also allows us to build the back end. And that is why it is a full stack framework. In Next.js, you can do a lot, for example. In order for you to add routing between pages, Next.js provides us with a file system-based router that we can definitely use. And we will learn all about that later. Next.js also gives us the ability to fetch data in different ways. So it also allows us to do client-side rendering as well as server-side rendering, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, search engine optimization is really important in your application if that specific app needs to rank higher on search engines, such as Google. Then in that case, Next.js also offers us with a really powerful metadata API so that you can get improved SEO and web shareability as well. Now, Next.js does a lot for us. Next.js also has a few special components that we can use, that the fact that we use them means that we get additional performance benefits. So this is what a framework does. A framework does give you a lot of magic out of the box, so you can focus on building seamless applications. Now, one topic we should definitely talk about in Next.js is the difference between a SPA workflow and a static site generation workflow. SPA means single page application. Whenever you think of React, you would think of single page application. This means that the page is only rendered on the browser and the browser just displays it on the page. Now, it's not great for search engine optimization because if you do inspect the browser elements, for example, the page source, then you will not necessarily see anything in there. So when bots are going to crawl your website, it's not going to discover any content on the page. So browsers on demand serve the page to the user. So if you take a look at this specific diagram, let's say this is a developer writing his blog on cookies because they really love cookies and they ship the blog code to the server on ilovecookies.com. Now, in a single page application, for example, they will ship the website blog to the server, and then every time the user asks for ilovecookies.com, either through search engines or by going to ilovecookies.com directly, the server is going to say, hey, sure, let me produce the HTML on demand and give it to you. Let me produce the HTML and JavaScript on demand and give it to you. Now, let's say there's one more user that comes up and asks for ilovecookies.com. The server is going to repeat the process and regenerate again the HTML on demand and give it to the browser. The browser can render it on the page. Now, this process can be really slow because browser is doing things on demand. Versus in a static site generation workflow, which is what Next.js is really powerful for, or you would also call that as pre-rendering, where we are pre-rendering the pages. In this case, if a developer writes his blog on cookies, builds his code and ships those blog files to the server on ilovecookies.com, and shares that code and shares the HTML to the CDN, which is a content delivery network. So what this developer is going to do, or what Next.js is going to help this developer do, is that they are going to say, hey, I've written these 10 blog posts. Let's just pre-download them and let's just store them on our nearest server. This way, let's say you are asking for data from, let's say, Hong Kong or United States, and the server closest to you is going to get called and they are going to give you the HTML that's already pre-generated for that specific blog. On top, in a SPA workflow, this is done on demand, versus in an SSG workflow, the work is already done for you. All the CDN does is that it returns that predefined work. So when the user asks for ilovecookies.com, the server is already going to send you the pre-built files, and they are just like, here you go. This means the response time, the initial page load, is going to be really fast. And when search engines look for ilovecookies.com, they're going to get all the HTML code embedded of the blog. This means that ilovecookies.com is going to get discovered on different search engines, and it's going to make the site really fast as well. So that is the difference between a SPA workflow and a static site generation workflow, also known as pre-rendering. Now, React is popularly known for SPA, versus Next.js is popularly known for pre-rendering. So we cannot necessarily compare React with Next.js, because we cannot compare a library with a framework when in fact Next.js leverages React as a library. But what we are going to do in this specific course is we are going to compare something called as Vite with React, which gives you the tooling necessary so that whenever we cannot pick a framework, we know how to configure our application. And depending on your use case, you can decide, hey, should I go with the framework or not? And also you will learn the differences. So even if you do go with the framework, you will know what the other route is as well. So Vite is a really powerful next generation front-end tooling. It does provide you with lightning fast HMR, which means that anytime you make changes in your files, in your local file system, those changes are immediately available to you on the browser. You don't need to refresh the page or do anything of that sort. Now, Vite also has support for TypeScript, JSX, CSS, and a lot more. But at the same time, Vite also uses a roll-up build, which makes our development a lot faster. And roll-up is essentially a JavaScript module bundler that will compile all your code and make it really fast as you ship it to the browser for production, and also during development, as it already has a really powerful bundler which will bundle all your specific code. Now, Vite with Rollup gives you a plugin system, so we can basically plug and play exactly all the things we want in our application. Now, one disadvantage of using a framework like Next.js is that a lot of the decisions are made for us. So if we want to opt out of those decisions, we can't really, because it's going to be a lot harder for us to do that. So Vite is really powerful. So that's what we would be doing throughout this course. We would be essentially comparing and trying to see, hey, if a framework does provide us this, then what does Vite with React give us? At the same time, we will also be checking, hey, what features do we really want in our app, and what can a framework provide versus what a non-framework, versus what Vite plus React will provide us as well. This way we can compare and have a little bit of fun while building our application as well. My goal with this specific course is to help you decide and give you a solid understanding for how all of this works together. Now, to understand and learn the difference between the two, Next.js and also React plus Vite, we will be building an app, a recipe planner called as TastyNext and TastyReact. So let me quickly give you a demo. Now, these two apps are identical except minor design tweaks. Now, on this specific page, you will see a list of recipes from different cuisines. So on the page, you will see a list of different recipes that we pull from an API. Now, when we click on any specific recipe, you will read more details about the recipe, such as the name, what is the prep time and cook time, difficulty level, ingredients and instructions alongside an image. If you go back to all recipes, then you should see all the different recipes on the page as well. You will also be able to filter based on cuisine, such as Asian, American, Greek, Italian, Indian, and so on. So these are all the different recipes that you see on the page that we are retrieving from the API. So now let's say we were to shrink the size of the viewport, then this app is fully responsive, and we change from 4 columns to 3 columns, 2 columns, and 1 columns based on the viewport size. Now, the app is fully responsive on the recipe page as well, so it's easily readable on mobile, and also on different device sizes. Now, if you go back to all recipes, this is an identical app with the TastyReact app, wherein we will be building these cool gradients as well. All of this in Tailwind CSS, and all the different components that you see on the page are using the shadcn UI library. So you will be learning shadcn UI as well. And also, we will be using the latest and greatest Next.js features such as client and server components and so on. So this app is fully server rendered versus this app is not. And we will learn the differences between the two in this course as well. Now you will be learning all about building a really performant app in this specific course. So I'm really excited to get started. So let's dive in. So now let's take a look at how we can start a new project in React. Now the docs definitely recommend to use frameworks. In fact, they recommend a few frameworks that you can use with React. One is Next.js, other one is Remix, Gatsby. You want to use Expo for React Native applications and so on. Now the docs, they highly recommend using a framework because they say that by starting with the framework, you can get started with React quickly and avoid essentially building your own framework later, which is a valid point. So if we take a look at this specific section where the question is, can I use React without a framework? They say you can definitely use React without a framework. However, if you're building a new app, they recommend using a framework because even if you don't need routing or data fetching at first, you will likely want to add some libraries for them. As the JavaScript bundle grows with every new feature, you might have to figure out how to split the code for every route individually. Now, just to summarize all of this for you, what they're saying is React frameworks, they do a lot for you. So as a beginner React dev, or as you're starting a new project, you don't need to worry about all the bells and whistles that a framework provides you. So they highly recommend just going for a framework when it comes to React. But let's say we still don't want to use a framework and we have a specific use case, or we don't want to be tied to a specific cloud platform and so on. Then in that case, they basically recommend that, hey, you can roll up your own setup with React, grab React and React DOM from NPM, set up your custom build process with a bundler like Vite and or Parcel, and add other tools as you need them for routing, static generation, or server-side rendering, and more. So that's exactly what they tell us, and that's what we are going to do in this specific course. We are going to grab Vite as a bundler with React and add any specific capabilities as we want as we build our app further. Let's talk about the tech stack that we are going to use. We are going to definitely use Vite with React, for example, to start a project, to create a project. We are obviously going to use Next.js as a framework option with React. And then for styling our application, we are going to use a specific library called as shadcn. Shadcn UI has become so popular. It's because it allows you to build your component library. Now, a shadcn library uses Tailwind CSS underneath it. So we will be using Tailwind CSS to style our application. So you will be learning a bit of Tailwind along the way as well. But let me quickly talk about why we are using shadcn. Now, as we build our application, we don't want to start from scratch because we mainly want to focus on this specific crash course and the learnings of that. So what we are going to do is, let's say for this specific badge component, this card component, or anything else that we need in our app, we are mainly going to stick with using components from shadcn. Now keep this in mind. Take a look at the docs. It says it right here. Shadcn is not a component library. It is a collection of reusable components that you can copy paste in your apps. This means these are beautifully designed components that you can mainly just copy paste in your application. So you will only add that specific component and it will create a folder for you with that specific component code in it. So if you look at your package.json, there won't be any card of shadcn from it, because the motive with shadcn UI is that it's going to give you all these reusable components that you can just copy paste in your code and just right away use it. It's not going to be installed as a dependency. So we can make whatever changes we want and we can customize it however we like because the base is already provided to us. Plus it's open source and accessible, so it's really awesome. So for example, from this list, we're going to use the card component, and all we are going to do is use this command to add card, and we are also going to use the badge component to display all the different cuisines as well. At the same time, because it uses Tailwind, we are going to build our application further with Tailwind, so the rest of our page, whatever we see on this specific specific page or this page, all of it is going to be built using Tailwind CSS. Now let's go ahead and create our React application with Vite. Now if we head over to the getting started section, and if we scroll down, there's an option for scaffolding your first Vite project. Here, let's just copy this specific command. And we have two options. We could just copy this command and follow the prompts, or we could also just select the React as a template, for example. But let's just do this and see what the prompts are. So if you head over to our terminal, I've kind of divided the terminal into two halves. In the first one, we are going to set up a React with Vite, and the bottom one will set up our Next.js. So here, let's just paste what we copied. And now we're going to call this TastyReact, because this is the application that we are building, where we display the list of recipes and have the ability to filter them and view more information and follow the instructions of those recipes. Now you can call this whatever you like, but I'm going to call this TastyReact. Now here, let's just go with React as an option. I'm going to expand this a little bit, but let's just go with React as an option here when it comes to selecting a framework. At the same time, we are going to select TypeScript plus SWC as an option. So we definitely want TypeScript in our project, but we also need SWC. Now SWC is a extensible Rust-based platform, so it will help us in compiling and bundling, and it's 20 times faster than Babel. So we can basically compile and bundle our JavaScript code in a much faster manner. So since it's built on top of Rust, it's really fast as well. So that's the option we are going to select. And now let's just change the directory npm install. That will install all the packages for us to get started. And once it's done, we are going to run the development server. Now our Vite plus React application is ready to go. And now look at that. You can see that there is a counter example with Vite plus React ready to go, which is pretty awesome. Now let's see what the process looks like for Next.js. Now if you head over to the docs and head over to the getting started section, here make sure you follow the system requirements, making sure you have the latest Node.js version and any of these operating systems. So let's just go here and copy this specific command. Now create next app is a CLI tool that gives you a bunch of prompts, just like we saw with Vite, to bootstrap our application. So now here again, if we go to the bottom section of the terminal, just gonna paste what we copied, and here let's just call this TastyNext. We are going to use TypeScript, we are going to use ESLint, we are going to use Tailwind CSS. We're just going with the defaults at this point. And we will talk about app router a bit later, but let's just for now say yes. And we don't want to customize anything. Again, this is going to reinstall the dependency. The one difference here is that with Vite, we had to go ahead and run npm install, versus with Next.js, this create next app already installs it for us. So all we can do is just go to TastyNext and then just run our development server. It starts off our project on localhost 3001. Now there you go. We have our Next.js application also ready to go. What we need to do is add shadcn in our application. Now, if we go to the installation section, we can pick these two frameworks. We could go with Vite or we could go with Next.js. Now let's just go ahead and add shadcn to Vite. Now remember, we have already created a React project, so we are going to only add Tailwind with all these different configurations to our project. But before we do that, let me just give you a quick walkthrough of the projects that we have already set up. So now let's just stop the server in both cases and open up the application in Visual Studio Code. Now Visual Studio Code is going to be the editor of my choice, but feel free to use whatever you like. Now here, let's just open up VS Code. So now let's just go ahead and check out our Vite with React application. Now this project is TastyReact, which is configured with Vite plus React. So here we have a public folder where we will be storing all our assets. Node modules has all our packages needed to bootstrap the specific application. Then we have a source directory. Now again, there's a specific assets folder, which you can add any of your assets to as well alongside the public folder. Now, if we go to the app.tsx, this is the main page of our application. Remember, we saw the counter example. This is exactly where it is created. So app.tsx is the main file, is the main page of our app. And it also has a app.css with all the specific CSS code as well. And then we have a index.css file, which right now does not have anything configured, but has a overall look and feel. This is where we would be adding Tailwind CSS. Then we have the main.tsx file. Now, the difference between a Next.js application versus a single page application, as this specific one, is that it is always going to create the React DOM on the specific root element over here and is going to render the app. Now, app is the main page of application, but this is how usually it works. And this specific root element is in fact declared over here. So you have the div ID. So all your JavaScript code, all your HTML code essentially is going to be mounted here, is what it's saying over there, right here. Then we have the index.html file, which has our HTML page itself. So we can modify it later if you want. And then this is where our JavaScript code that's going to get bundled and minified and shown here. Then we have the tsconfig file with configuration for your project. And then we also have a Vite config file. So now Vite config file works really well with the plugin system from Rollup. Now, if we click on the specific option, you can see all the different ways we can configure this specific Vite config file. Now, remember I said that Vite uses Rollup to power the plugin system. This is why we have React as a plugin. Now, let's say we want to add some other plugin here, for example, then we could just do that in the plugins array. And Vite has a bunch of different plugins that we can use, which gives us the plug and play optionality that we want. Now, again, we are importing React from plugin React SWC and then define config, which is this specific function right here that's getting exported from the Vite package itself. So this is how the TastyReact project works. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the Next.js project. Now, if you take a look at TastyNext, we have a directory here called as the .next directory. Now, .next directory will have all our build files there. So whenever Next.js runs our development server, all the files that get built are right here, and Next.js uses different JSON files to map all the different individual files. Then we have the app directory. The app directory is basically the app router that we talked about in Next.js, and that's why we have the app directory. Now, the Next.js has one more router that we will talk about in the routing section as well. But for now, in the app directory, we have the page.tsx file. Now, this page.tsx file is essentially the page that we see on our localhost 3001. So this specific page will have all the code for it. So Next.js uses specific file names as special files. For example, page.tsx would mean that this is the index page in our application. Similarly, we have layout that basically surrounds our entire application. It wraps our entire application. And here we have the HTML document, for example, and the children would be all the individual pages that we would declare in our app, because layout is in fact the root layout. Now, we also have a specific font setup here called as inter. Again, we will take a look at fonts a bit later. And we also have the metadata API, where we can configure our specific title and description for SEO purposes later. But layout is essentially the root layout that wraps our entire application. Then we have the global CSS file, which has our global CSS configuration, and this is where we are setting up Tailwind. Now, keep this in mind, in Vite with React, we still need to add Tailwind, but be setting up this specific project in the create next app prompt, we already said yes for Tailwind. That's why Tailwind is already pre-configured, which is pretty awesome. So one less step for us to configure. But these are the three things that we need for Tailwind. This is the code for global CSS. Then in the public folder is where all the public assets would live, for example. Then at the same time, we have a next config file, where we will configure specific values for our Next.js project that we will take a look at later. Then we have the post CSS config file, so that we can basically add CSS code inside JavaScript. It's for compiling CSS code with JavaScript, and this is mainly used for Tailwind. Then we have the Tailwind config file, which is a global Tailwind configuration. Whenever you want to extend the existing design system of Tailwind, then you can definitely use this specific file as well. Now, I do have a course on Tailwind that you may want to check out right here, which is a Tailwind CSS crash course if you're interested. This specific crash course will give you a in-depth overview of how Tailwind works. So if you're interested, definitely check that out. But going back to our project, this is where all our Tailwind styles are set up, and where we would extend the existing design system or even replace it if we like. Then we have the tsconfig file, which has our configuration for our project. Now, this is how all the project files are set up whenever we bootstrapped our Vite plus React application alongside our Next.js application. Now, as we saw earlier, the app router comes with Tailwind CSS as a CSS framework by default, as we chose while setting up our project. So let me quickly give you a walkthrough of Tailwind CSS so you know exactly how to style our application and will be able to follow along as well. So for example here, Tailwind CSS is essentially a utility-first CSS framework. Now, if you want to learn Tailwind in depth, then I also have a free crash course for you on Tailwind CSS that you should also check out on my channel right here. If you want to learn in depth, then definitely check out the Tailwind crash course on my channel. Now, Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework. So for example, instead of typing display flex in a CSS file, all you're going to do is write flex. Instead of writing padding top is 4 pixel or 16 pixel or 1 rem or 2 rem or so on, you are going to write pt-4. So that is the beauty of Tailwind. These are all different utilities. Now you can think of these utilities as essentially JavaScript functions that return the specific CSS for us, for example. Essentially, that's what they are. Now, the reason why Tailwind has gained so much popularity because you don't need to create a separate file altogether. You can just inline the CSS here. So for example, if you hover over this, then you have display flex here. Now, if you want to install the specific plugin that I do have, then you can go to extensions in Visual Studio Code and then look for Tailwind CSS IntelliSense, and you will be able to get the IntelliSense needed to style your application. Now, heading back to page.tsx, if you see min h screen, then it's 100 VH, which is 100 viewport. So it sets the min height as well. So these are different utilities that Tailwind provides us. So if you head to getting started, you can see the utility first fundamentals here and why they're important. But if we take a look at responsive design, then Tailwind does provide us a breakpoint prefix as well so that we can style our application for different viewports. So for example, by default, Tailwind focuses on mobile and then we go to desktop. For example, over here, P24 applies to all viewports. But if I'll specifically say I want P24 to apply to mobile, but let's say I want P64 to apply to, let's say, desktop, then I can just add large as a prefix. Tailwind also provides us with a design system out of the box. So it gives us a bunch of colors already, all these different swatches that we can just use. So for example, if I want to change the background color of the page to BG, I don't know, gray 800, then I could easily do that thanks to Tailwind. But at the same time, I can change this to pink as well if I want, but it provides us on a scale from of 50 to 900 or 950. These are all the different colors that Tailwind provides us, and it goes all the way to 950. Now, it also provides us a spacing scale. If you want to learn anything about getting good at building really good design, then you need to make sure that you have a really good spacing scale. Now, we don't need to worry about it because Tailwind automatically provides us for us, which is this default spacing scale. For example, if you use PX4, then it means it's 16 pixel or 1 rem and so on. So as you saw over here, P24 is adding a padding of 6 RAM here, but if I add say PX, then it will only add padding left and padding right. And if I want only on the y-axis, then I can just say PY. So all these utilities are really cool and really great, and you will learn more Tailwind as we build our application further. But keep this in mind that I will be providing you all the Tailwind styles so you know exactly how they work, but I won't be necessarily going in depth in Tailwind. So now let's go ahead and set up shadcn in our projects. Now, again, we have already created this specific React project with Vite, but now let's go ahead and add Tailwind to our Vite plus React project. So let's just copy this and paste it right here. Similarly, there's one more command that we need to initialize Tailwind. Let's copy that as well. Now let's initialize Tailwind, and next let's just add the following code that they recommend us in our tsconfig file where we are configuring configuring our project. So in the tsconfig file, let's go ahead and add the base URL and paths here. We're basically saying that the paths, anytime we import using @, it's going to resolve it to source / whatever. Now, next we need to install the types for node to the Vite types for node, and also we need to configure the alias in the Vite config file as well. So let's just copy this and then paste it. Now let's also just go ahead and copy how we can resolve the aliases, because we already have everything. We also need to import path from path. Now let's just go to Vite config file, and here let's just paste it, and we need path, so path is going to come from path. We can just import path from path. There you go. Now that we have the path added, let's just go ahead and run the shadcn UI init command to set up our project. Let's just copy this, and now let's just go here and paste it. Now this is going to initialize our shadcn UI components that we want and the global configuration for how components would be managed. So would you like to use script? Yes. We're going to go with the default style. We're going to use the base color. Now, if you take a look at here, they also tell us how to answer these questions too. So for the global CSS file, we're just going to copy this. Then we will be using CSS variables, and the answer is yes. Then we are going to use no. Where is your Tailwind config file? Let's just copy what they have here. Where is your located? It's right here. Then the aliases for components are going to be at @/components. So let's just paste that. Similarly, the utils are just going to be these utils. And then are you going to use React Server components? The answer is no. And write configurations to components.json. Now this is the JSON file which will manage all our components. So we're going to just say yes. Now again, it's writing components.json file and initializing our project. Now let's go ahead and check our project. So now we have the components folder as you see here, but we also have the components.json file with the different aliases. At the same time, we have a rough schema for where all the files are for shadcn to manage. Now let's just go and test it out by adding a button component. So let's just copy this. Let's head over to the terminal and add shadcn button. Now that we add this, watch what happens. Now here in the components folder, now we have a UI folder and it has a button.tsx. Now remember, in package.json, we're not going to see like an import for button, but in fact we have the entire code for button literally pasted right here. This means we can modify this button however we like. Now this specific button has different variants such as default, destructive, outline, secondary, and so on. So if you want to use that, we can as well. Now let's just go and use this button in app.tsx. Now again, honestly, we don't even need all of this, so we can just pretty much get rid of it, and these as well. And similarly in index.ts, CSS, we can give everything as is, but in app.css, we don't need any of this. So let's just get rid of that as well. And now what we can do is just add the button from UI components button from shadcn, and I'll just say hi there. So now this specific button is added. So now let's just go ahead and check out our app. So now here, if we refresh the page, nothing happens because our app is not running yet. So let's just run the app. Now let's just go ahead and refresh the page, and look at that. Hi there is right there. That means shadcn components have been installed successfully. Now alongside button, we also want badge and card. So let's just add that as well. So let's just copy this and add card. Same time, let's add badge as well. Now you can see card and badge are already added here. So we are good to go. Now let's just go ahead and install shadcn with Next.js. So if we go to the docs and in the installation section, this time let's select Next.js as a framework. And again, we already have the project. So all we need to do is initialize shadcn UI in Next.js. Now here, let's just copy what we pasted, initialize the UI. Let's go with the default style. Let's go with Slate. Would you like to use CSS variables? Yes. And it's going to write components.json. Now let's just go ahead and also add card as well as badge here as well. At the same time, we also need button. So now let's just go ahead and check out shadcn right here. So we have the components directory, we have badge, button, and card ready to go. And we also have a components.json file, which is pretty awesome. And now if we go to page.tsx, again, we can just pretty much get rid of all of this. So we don't even need it. And now what we're going to do is just use button just to test out that shadcn is configured. We can just call this hi there, get rid of image import, which unused. Now let's just go ahead and restart the server. Now let's just refresh this page really quickly, and look at that, hi there shadcn button is also configured here. So that's exactly how you would configure shadcn in Next.js versus Vite. Specific setup, it was pretty much the same, except that we had to install Tailwind in Vite plus React, versus with Next.js it was already pre-configured. At the same time, the setup was a little bit simpler with Next.js than it was with Vite plus React, but more or less it was pretty much the same, so it felt like almost like the same experience, so no complaints here. Let's go ahead and add routes inside of our application. So for example, whenever we click on any of the recipe card, then we definitely need to route to another route called as /recipe/1. Now remember, TastyReact as well as TastyNext are identical applications with maybe little minor CSS changes, but majority of the functionality is pretty much the same. So the same routing is also needed inside of Next.js as well, where we route to /recipe/1. At the same time, when we click on back to all recipes, they get taken back to the home page. Similarly, if we go to the recipe page and if we click on the nav bar and click on TastyNext, then we also get taken back to the home page. That's pretty much the functionality that we have here. So routing is something that's really important and one of the most fundamental things that you need inside of any application. So when it comes to routing with React and Vite, we have a few options. So first, we can go with a really popular library called as React Router. Now, React Router is one of my favorite libraries and something that I have used for many projects, and I have really used that in production applications, and this specific library has scaled really well. So there's definitely React Router as an option. Then we also have another option called as Vite. Now, Vite is essentially a do one thing, do it well Vite plugin, where it also offers us routing capabilities. So for example, it also uses a file system based routing that Next.js offers as well. So we can definitely use Vite with Vite to configure our application and get routing too. Now, Vite doesn't just give us routing, it also gives us, and basically is identical to what a framework provides us, different data fetching capabilities and so on. We won't be using Vite, but know that this is a viable option that you can use alongside Vite with React as well. We will be sticking to using React Router. Now, when it comes to React Router, we have a few different options and few different routers for different scenarios that we could use in our application. For example, these are the 4 different types of routers that React Router offers us. One is the create browser router, then we have the create memory router, create hash router, and create static router. Create browser routers is what we would use and is the recommended router for all React Router projects. So this is what we would be using. But you would use create memory router for testing and component development, essentially. Like for example, when you're using Storybook, and you would use something called as create hash router, for example, when you're configuring a web server, and then you would use something called as create static router, but again, you are rendering things on your server, for example, Node.js and so on. Again, this is more for server side, but we will be using something called as create browser router. So if we go to the documentation for browser router, what it does, it stores the current location in the browser's address bar with using clean URLs and navigates using browser's built-in history stack. Because browser has a history stack already, that's what it utilizes to route between pages. So that's what we would be using in this specific project. But now on the other hand, when it comes to using Next.js uses a file system based router. This means that whenever you create a new file with that specific name, then you will be able to route to it. So you can define different routes inside of Next.js, and those routes are also called as route segments. So if we take a look at this specific diagram, whenever you want to route to the index page, it's called as the index route, and you would just create a new file called as page.tsx, which is already what we saw as well. For example, we have a page.tsx inside the app directory. But then whenever you want to create a dynamic route, which means the slug is going to be different. What I mean by that is, let's say we go from one card to the other, then this value is going to change. Right now it's 1, but if you go to some other card, it's 2 and so on. So that specific value is different, and that's what a dynamic route is, wherein this specific ID, which would be the recipe ID, would be different. So what we would need to do is create a page.tsx file by creating box brackets inside of recipes and then creating a folder with box brackets. So that's what a file system based router does. All you need to do is create new files and then you would be able to route to them. So there are no multiple options for creating different routers in Next.js. But in Next.js, there are two different types of routers. One is the app router and the other one is the pages router. Now remember, when we bootstrapped our Next.js project, we selected the app router because app router is the default router right now inside of Next.js. But before app router came along, we had something called as the pages router. In the pages router, it was still a file system based router, but the functionality that you get in that specific router was quite different. With app router, we get capabilities like React server components and client components. The APIs are slightly different with the app router, and all the new features are now available inside app router. But this does not mean that pages router is outdated or deprecated or legacy in any way. Pages router is still used by many companies all across the world. So this is really important that if you are using pages router, it's completely fine because many applications are built using Next.js with the pages router. But as the React team partnered with the Next.js team and we had special capabilities for React server components and client components exclusively available in Next.js, and the way you create components changes inside of Next.js with app router, that is why a new router was born called as app router. So if you want to look into transitioning from pages router to app router, do it slowly and do it one route at a time, because you can still have app pages router working alongside app router as you migrate those different routes. But that's how routing works inside of Next.js. In our specific project, we will be definitely sticking with app router as it is the latest one and it has all the recommended features that we're looking for. So if you're starting a new project, I highly recommend using the app router itself. Now let's go ahead and set up a browser router. Again, we want one route which is called as the index route. This is more of a Next.js convention of using page.tsx. We'll still be using the same terms for index route and dynamic route and React router as well. So what we are going to do is, again, we already have create route, but we are going already have create route here, but we are going to create a browser router and wrap it where we mount our application. So let's just copy this and now let's just close all of this because we don't need it. And now inside of our main.tsx, let's just wrap app with browser router. Now in order for us to use browser router, we need to install it. So let's just go to, so here again we can just install these things to get the React router. Just copy this, head over to the terminal and add React router inside of TastyReact, and also let's just restart the server. Now what we can do is just go ahead and import browser router. Just go ahead to our documentation and import browser router from React router DOM. Alright, so now we have browser router ready to go. But now if we go inside app, right now we have a button there. But let's just make sure that now app is the central place where we define all our routes. Means if you take a look here, we have these specific routes. So what we are going to do is, instead of button, let's just get rid of it. Let's just define routes here. Now we are going to import routes from React router, same route as well from React router. Now this means that this is the default route, but what we want to do is we want to use the element property inside of React router, and let's create a new page called as the home page. Now even though app is hosting all the routes, let's just separate the pages out. So what we can do is inside of source directory, let's just go ahead and create a new pages folder, and here let's just create a home page. Now this is where our code for recipes will be located. So let's just call this home page. Now again, what we can do is we can just use the button that we had over here and let's just say, hi, I am home from shadcn. So everything works as expected, but here let's just import homepage as well. But now this needs to be a React. We need to declare it here. So this needs to be a React node. So let's just declare it here as well. So if everything works as expected, then we should see, hi, I'm home here, which is amazing. But we don't just need one route. We actually need two. So whenever we go to another route, we need /recipes/1. So what we can do over here is let's just create a dynamic route. And the way you would do that is by saying recipe/recipe ID. And this recipe ID is the dynamic segment inside the specific URL, inside the specific route. And now instead of home page, we're just going to create a new page called as the recipe page. Now here inside of home page, let's just call this recipe page.tsx. Again, let's just create a new functional component. Let's just call this recipe page. And now let's just say, hi, I am a recipe. Beautiful. Now we have a recipe page as well as we have a home page. So let's just go ahead and import recipe page here. This way we're saying the recipe pages go here. So let's just go ahead and try it out. So now if we go back to our app, if we let's say go to /recipes/1, you can see we get hi, I'm a recipe. But let's say if I just go to whatever ID, it should still take us to /hi, I'm a recipe page because this specific value is dynamic. But let's say I go to /recipes page. Let's see what happens. Nothing happens. It's a blank page. So what we can do is there's one more route in Next.js as well as React Router, which is called as a catch-all route. So instead of following this specific convention, what we need to do is we're going to say, hey, if the route path is going to be asterisk, that means all of them, let's just render a element. Now we're just gonna say over here to keep it simple that this page does not exist, for example, right? Just to make sure that we are catching all the routes. So right now, if we head over to our app, you can see we get this page does not exist, which is going to be an indication for us that, hey, we need to create this page if we like. But for now, let's just keep it as is. We don't need to worry about it. This is how you can basically create different routes with React Router. But let's say we want to do the same thing with Next.js. We want to create an index route, a dynamic route, and a catch-all route that we just talked about. What we can do here is inside of our app, we have the page.tsx, which is our index page, so we can keep it as is. So let's just create a recipes folder and let's create another folder called as recipe ID. And because Next.js has all these special files where the way we need to define these pages, we need to create a new file called as page.tsx. That means this becomes a default page inside of recipe ID. So if we create a page, for example, here let's just say, hi, I am a recipe page, for example. So now if we head over to the browser and go to our create next app, and let's say we go to /recipes/ whatever value, we do get hi, I'm a recipe page. Let's say we go to /recipes page, which does not exist at this point. Let's see what happens. The Next.js automatically gives us a 404 page. This page could not be found, which is exactly what we try to do inside of our React Router as well. So we can keep this as is. We don't need to create a specific special route for this one, but this is good to know that in Next.js it automatically handles it already. But speaking of special files, like we talked about page.tsx and layout.tsx, let's review what are the different special files inside of Next.js. Now we have a few special files inside of Next.js. These are all the different files. We have layout, page, loading, error, and so on. And we will take a look at few of these in the specific course. But for now, let's just focus on layout and page. Now the layout page, the special thing about this page is that whatever you add in this specific page will not re-render, and this is where you would typically add your header and footer. So whenever we are ready to add our navigation bar, we would be adding it here in the layout file. Similarly, we could also add it in the footer as well. And then page.tsx is essentially a page itself. So whatever gets rendered inside of layout is in fact the page file itself. So anytime you want to create a new page, a new route, then you need to call it page.tsx. But let's say you want the loading functionality, you need to create a page called as loading.tsx and so on. So these are different special files inside of Next.js. Now, by the way, if you're interested in checking out and downloading all the visuals that I'm sharing in this specific course, then definitely take a look in the description below where you can download all the visual assets alongside all the links that I've offered in this specific course. So definitely check that out. So now if you were to compare routing with Next.js compared to React Router or React with Vite, you can see a few differences. It was really simple and easy in Next.js because Next.js already had the router set up, so we did not need to set up anything additional. All we needed to do was create new files and make sure those files match the naming conventions that we talked about in the special files visuals. Versus in React Router, we had to set up the router, we had to follow the docs and make sure all the routes are properly configured. Now, if you don't follow the right conventions, especially in a React Router world, the routes are not going to re-render and you may wonder why. At the same time, there are different specific routers as well. There's the browser router, hash router, static router, and so on that we took a look at. So you need to know which router is best for each scenario. The good thing about Next.js is that all these decisions are made for us. So like all we need to do is just create new files in a file system and the routes will be created provided we follow the naming conventions. So you can definitely see how a framework is definitely powerful when it comes to creating a router. As a beginner React dev, this might be daunting for you where you have to set up your own router. But as an experienced React dev, you might, or as someone who's maybe architecting the app in your company, maybe they can make those choices to decide, hey, like, should I go for file system based router that Next.js offers us, or should I just create my own router with React plus Vite, or even like use something like Vite that we looked at earlier as well. So these are different ways you can create routing options inside of our applications, and you can then decide which one is best for a specific use. Depending on your use case, you may prefer one over the other. So one quick tip I want to share: when you're navigating docs inside of Next.js, make sure that whenever you search anything in the documentation, you are selecting the appropriate router. Because we are using the app router, make sure that is selected. But if you want to search something in pages router, then select that instead, because the APIs are slightly different, and that's why it's important that you get pointed to the right APIs when you search for it in your documentation. Now let's go ahead and add a navigation bar inside of our application. For example, right now, if we look at TastyReact, and also if we take a look at TastyNext, this is essentially a navigation bar. Now shadcn also has a navigation bar, but we won't be necessarily using that because our navigation bar is quite simple. It literally has one text with a specific font, and then whenever you click on any card, you click on the navigation bar, it takes you back to home. So basically it routes you back to home. So what we need is we can just create like a custom simple component with navigation, and then that would be it. So let's just go ahead and create it. So now here in components, let's create a new component called as navbar.tsx. Now what we can do is let's just create a functional component, and then here let's just call this navbar. And now what we can do is just copy what I'm gonna give you. And what we're gonna do is just replace this code with navigation bar. Now this is the code I've already prepared, so you can take a look at the GitHub link in the cheat sheet to check it out if you like. But here, this is what we'll be calling TastyReact. Now the best spot for us to place this would be in the app.tsx right above routes, because this is sort of the entry point for our app, the main page. So let's just add this here and then save it. Now if we go to our application, you can see TastyReact is already on the page. But there's one more thing. We obviously need to also make sure that we are able to route to home page as well. We can just use anchor link for that, and let's just wrap it up inside of each one. Now you can see that TastyReact is right here, and then if we are on the recipes route, but if I go back to TastyReact, then I'm on the home route now, which is what we want. Similarly, let's do the same inside of Next.js as well. So now again, instead of Next.js, we want TastyNext here. So let's just go ahead and do the same. So what we can do is just copy this nav bar, go inside our UI folder and paste it, because it's pretty much the same. But now inside of Next.js, instead of using the anchor tag, we will be learning a special component inside of Next.js. For example, we will be learning about the link component. The link component is essentially a React component that extends the HTML anchor element to provide prefetching and client-side navigation between routes. This might sound really hard, but what it's essentially saying is that link is a special component. It's a special React component. What it's going to do is it still uses the anchor tag underneath it, but it also has additional capabilities such as prefetching. So if we take a look at what prefetching is a way to preload a route in background before the user visits it. So for example, if we take a look at this specific app, let's just refresh the page, clear it, for example, completely. Now, this is an app that we are building inside of my Next.js course, so you should definitely check it out if you're interested. This course will teach you everything that you need to know to master Next.js and build production-ready modern application. So definitely check this out if you're interested. It is a really comprehensive course, and it also comes with a cheat sheet that you can download so you can follow along as I build the course as well. This is the Easy Sell app that we build inside of that course. Now, this is an e-commerce app, for example. Now watch what happens and how the link component performs here. We are using the link component to wrap these cards. Now, as I scroll down, more images get downloaded. For example, we have the Nike shoe, which is not in the viewport yet, but it's about to come in the viewport. And that's what prefetching is. Link component is going to prefetch pages as it's about to appear in the viewport, so you get that additional performance benefit. Plus, you're not just downloading pages that the user may not even see. Because for example, in a site like Amazon, there might be way too many pages. Now imagine if Amazon were to use Next.js, or were to use the next link component from Next.js, then in that case, because it's such an image heavy site, you will see a huge performance benefit, because Next.js is only going to load the things that are in the viewport or what's about to come in the viewport. This will make the initial load really fast, fast and make your website really fast. So for example, if you head over to the Easy Sell app, the Nike shoe is about to come, but you can see how as we're about to scroll down, this is the dog photo, and that's what shows up here. How prefetching works inside of link component. So that's what we are going to use, one, to wrap each of our cards inside of link component. So only the ones that are needed will show up in the viewport. But also in our TastyNext navbar, we are also going to use link component. Now, even though prefetching inside of TastyNext navbar might not have that much of an advantage because it's just routing to the main page. But if you think about it, whenever you want to use the link component whenever you're routing between internal routes, because of those additional capabilities of performance and prefetching and all of that we took a look at. But let's say we want to route TastyNext to my website. Now, this is an external link at kulkarniankita.com. So in that case, you don't necessarily want to use the link component. We just want to use the pure old anchor tag that we took a look at in TastyReact while building the TastyReact navbar. So let's just go ahead and add link component inside of our application. We can just copy this line of code, and now let's just, instead of TastyReact, it should be TastyNext, and let's just wrap it with link component. Now let's just import link from next link, and instead of dashboard it should go to home page, and then instead of TastyReact it should be TastyNext. Now make sure to close the link tag as well. So now we need to make sure that we add the navbar inside of layout, because remember, that's where we discussed that all our routes, all our headers and footer will be in the layout, because one, they do not re-render, and second, it wraps our entire application. So here, right above children, we can just add navbar. See, navbar is going to be imported from there, and just save it. So now if we go back and see, you can see TastyNext is right here, but we have also added the link component. So this is on recipes page. So if we click on TastyNext, it should take us back to home. So if you click that, look at that, we are also redirected back to home, which is exactly what we want. Let's talk about the different rendering mechanisms in modern applications. So you may have heard of client and server rendering, and we definitely took a look at the single page application workflow and the static site generation or pre-rendering application workflow before. But let's talk a little bit more about client and server rendering and the different mechanisms needed in the modern applications today. Again, this diagram really does a great job. I've asked AI to generate this for me, to use an analogy of someone cooking in the kitchen, like a person cooking in the kitchen. So on the left hand side, we have client rendering, and the right hand side, we have server rendering. On the left hand side with client rendering, you can think of it as the chef giving you a bunch of ingredients such as the dough, the vegetables, the bread, the sauces, and everything. And this person right here is putting together all the ingredients and then baking it and putting it on the pizza dough, for example. It definitely takes some time as they collect all the ingredients together and place it and form this beautiful pizza, for example. Now, you can literally think of this as client rendering. When you visit a specific website, it's like the browser putting together everything that you need on the page. That's your headers, your images, assets, JavaScript files, and so on the page to give you a fully cooked pizza, to give you a fully baked website. The browser is basically going to act like this person who's going to put together all these ingredients together and making sure your website is functional and exactly how you want. It will definitely take a bit of time if the website is complex enough, right? Because the person is going to take a lot longer. The browser is going to take some time to put together that web page for the user. So this means that the initial load of your web page, depending on the complexity of your website, the number of assets on it, and so on, and will be really slow if you have a lot going on your web page. So what's exactly server rendering then? Well, this time the chef cooks the entire pizza. The pizza is ready made and ready to go. All the assets are all there. All the ingredients in the pizza are all there. It's basically a ready to eat pizza. You get to enjoy your meal right away without doing any extra work. When you visit a specific website, the server, a powerful computer somewhere else, for example, is going to prepare the whole web page and give you the ready to eat pizza, for example. It sends the browser a complete ready to view page, and all the browser needs to do is just show it onto the page. That is, hydrate onto the page. So you see the web page immediately, just just like you can eat a fully cooked pizza because you get a ready to eat pizza. That's what server rendering is. Because a powerful computer is really powerful, all the resources are ready to go, and in server rendering, you're just gonna get the page ready to go. So that's the difference between client rendering and server rendering. So now if you think of React with Vite, for example, React mainly is known for building single page applications like we just saw. What React does is what we described here as client rendering, versus what Next.js does is that it gives you the option of server rendering by default, generating the HTML page in advance and showing it to the user. So this is why many folks opt for frameworks like Next.js or even Remix, Gatsby, and so on because of the server rendering capabilities. Over to TastyReact, which is our spa application. If we go to inspect and go to network tab and then disable JavaScript and refresh the page, you will see a blank application. And if we head over to page source, then what we see here is literally all the assets that are ready to download, and then there is a script tag with a div id root tag. Now all this JavaScript still needs to be downloaded, and that's how the page will get functional. But we don't see any HTML that was there on the page. Now let's say this is not great for search engines, because when search engine bots go to check out your website, they're not going to care about which fancy technology your site is using. All they're going to look at is the source and see what's on your page and basically decide where it should rank on Google. Now, because all they're going to see is div id root, and until JavaScript gets downloaded, then that's when they will see the page. The initial load time is going to be really slow, and it's not what you want at all. Let's say we go to a Next.js website. Now this is my blog and it is fully built in Next.js. Now let's say we do the same thing here. We go to sources and then just say disable JavaScript. Minute we do that, and let me just refresh the page. The page is fully functional. You know why? Because the HTML is already generated thanks to server rendering and pre-rendering. So if we take a look at view page source, I'm just going to enable line wrap here. It's a special plugin I've installed in my browser. If we do that, you can see that all the HTML code is right here. In fact, let's just take a better example. If you go to a specific blog post and go to the page source and again enable line wrap, then you should see the entire blog post here. So when a bot visits the website, they can exactly see what's on my page and are able to then rank my website higher, because my initial load time is going to be really fast and they are going to recognize everything that's on the page. That's what I mean by client rendering and server rendering. Why you may want to opt in more for server rendering versus client rendering, which is our single page applications in general. React is in fact client rendered versus Next.js is in fact server rendered. And not just that, it has a few other options that we will take a look at next, but this is why you may want to opt into server rendering versus client rendering. Let's add these badges as well as let's add these cards as well. So in order for us to do that, we have already installed the component from shadcn. It's time for us to start using it. So let's just go ahead and implement that now. So let's do it in React first. So if we go to our home page and it says, hi, I'm home, for example, we don't need the button because we're not going to use it, but we definitely need a badge component for sure. So what we're going to do is here we will have a list of cuisines. So we're going to say cuisines. And then here, this is going to have our list of cuisines, which we will take a look at. But what we need is we're going to map through those list of cuisines. And here we're just going to add the badge component from shadcn. And we're going to map them. We're also going to return them here, or rather, let's just do this because this is just going to act as a return anyway. Then the second parameter of map is an ID. So we can use that ID and the name of the cuisine as a way to create a unique key for our badge component. So this is what we can do. Now these cuisines are just going to be an array of strings. So now I already have a list of cuisines. I'm just going to add that. So badge, we're going to override a few styles here. Now the variant for badge is going to be outline, but there are several different variants as well. We saw here it could be default, destructive, outline, and secondary. So let's just say cuisine is going to be badge. All right, so now if we go back here, you can see that we have all the list of elements. Now we also want to render a list of cards here too. So for that, let's just basically use the card component here. So we can just say card component. So the card component, let's just see the API for the card component itself. So if we take a look at the shadcn UI library, we have the card component, and there are two tabs here, the preview tab and the code tab. So we can always review the code that we want here. So what we can do is we really want a really simple card. So we can just pretty much just copy this. And then let's just paste what we copied and save it. Again, we will need to make sure we are importing all of this from shadcn components UI folder that we have. There you go. So now if you look at it, look at our card component, we have an image, we have a title, we have a footer, for example. So we could literally make it, this could be the header, this could be the body, the content, and then this could be the footer. That's exactly how we can configure this. So for that, we need an array of items. So before we go and call our API, which gives us a list of items, we need to first make sure we can just add some dummy data. So we can just say recipes, I guess. And then here, this literally could be the array of recipes. So here we can say ID is going to be 0. Or maybe let's just say start with 1. And then we will have a name, which is going to be something like chicken sandwich. And the cuisine is going to be American. Something like that. This way we can just map through it. So we can just say recipes.map, recipe. Again, same thing. Use the second parameter in the map function to use it for the key. So again, we can just say key is going to be recipe.name. And then it could be IDX, for example. At the same time, we can also use recipe.id as well if we like. But again, let's just keep it as is. So now instead of title, we can just have recipe.name. And then we don't really need a description. So let's just get rid of it. Similarly, instead of card content, we can have, ideally this would be an image, but let's just replace this. So we can just say this is going to be the name, this is going to be the footer, and this will be some image that we want. So now if we go back to our app, we can see that the card component is already ready here. We have the chicken sandwich and we have the footer, which is what we define in an array of elements. So now that we have, let's just get rid of all of this and then paste what I just copied right here. Because again, like I mentioned, I'm going to give you the structure and the CSS for it. So now we can just get rid of header altogether, or header could have the image here eventually. But for now, we don't need to worry about it. At the same time, we need the key back. So we can say recipe.name hyphen, and then we can just say recipe.idx. Oops. Here. All right. Or just idx. So now we have our basic card ready to go. We don't have servings, prep minutes, or cook time minutes. Just add it here inside of our servings is going to be 4. Prep time minutes is going to be 4. And then cook time minutes is probably going to be 5. Okay, so now we have our basic card component ready to go with the hover and all that. But obviously, we need to make sure that only shows one card. So we will add a div around it too, so that we have like 4 columns initially on desktop, and then 3 columns and 2 columns and so on. Just like we have here, where if we switch to, for example, different devices, then our columns increase, just like that. So we want something like this, so definitely let's configure that too. Again, let's just add the necessary styling for that. Now if we go back, look at that, we do have our card ready to go. Let's give it some page styling too, so that it looks how we want it to. Here, let's just replace this with these 2 elements and add another div. So now we have our card ready. Our card is looking pretty good, and obviously this is zoomed in, so this is how our card looks like. We definitely need an image, but our page structure looks pretty identical to what we want in this specific application. Now obviously we do want gradients as well, which we'll configure that a bit later, but for now let's focus on getting real data for TastyReact. So let's talk about data fetching inside of React with Vite alongside Next.js. Now, we will be using this dummy JSON data to get the list of recipes. So if we take a look at our docs, there are a bunch of different recipes here, and this is what we will be focusing on. It will give us a list of recipes, for example, and then it has everything that we need. Now, let's say we go to a specific ID, then this gives us a specific recipe as well that we can get when we go to the individual recipe page, for example. So that's what we would be using for data fetching. Now, in order for us to fetch data inside of a React Vite application, what we could do is use the fetch API. Now, this is a very common fetch function that we could use. It returns a promise, and then we can use fetch to basically fetch any specific resource that we want. So we could use the fetch API to fetch the list of recipes and then individual recipes as well. But in React and Vite, like I mentioned, we have Vite, which already has different data fetching mechanisms that we can use if we were to use Vite to basically get the list of items. Now, this would mean that we don't necessarily need to client render. We could in fact server render and opt into different data fetching mechanisms as we like as well. So, for example, inside of data fetching, we have different modes such as SSR, which is server-side rendering, SPA. That means if you want SPA for some reason, then we could do that as well. SSG, which is static site generation, HTML only, so the page is only rendered to HTML with no zero or minimal JavaScript, and so on. So this is totally a doable option. But in our case, we're not using Vite, but I want to definitely tell you that this is an option that we could use with Vite and React. But in our case, we're just going to go with fetch. We're going to use fetch to fetch the list of recipes. But this is great for Vite plus React, and we can just use fetch in one of the React hooks, basically fetch the data and manage state locally. But when it comes to fetching data in Next.js, there are a few different ways we could approach this. Now, Next.js also offers us a fetch API, but a special fetch API. Next.js extends the native fetch API, and it allows us to configure the caching behavior inside of our application. So remember how I said that we could server render an app or a client render an app and so on? In Next.js, in fact, there are a few different ways you could fetch data itself. So one is called a static site generation. What this means is that we still use the browser fetch, but Next.js will extend the specific fetch function and add a property called as cache force cache. This means that whenever you use this specific function, by default, your request data is just going to be cached. And unless you purge that specific cache, that data is going to stay. This means that anytime the user accesses the data, it's in fact cached on the server, and you're getting that cached data over and over again. On the other hand, say your data does get stale after a bit. For example, in our application, if we were to go ahead and cache all of this data, but let's say that we change our title, for example, then in that case, now the data is stale. So what we could do in Next.js is we can use something called as incremental static regeneration, which would mean that every hour the data is going to get revalidated, that we're going to get fresh data. We're going to request for fresh data. Every hour, the the first user that requests for this specific data the first time is going to still get stale data, but the next time any new user is going to get fresh data, because that's going to be a signal for Next.js that, hey, go fetch new data. And lastly, we have server-side rendering, where we can add a cache no store, which means that there's going to be no caching, and we are going to have fresh data every single time, but still we will have the capabilities where HTML is pre-rendered and then we show the data after as well. So these are different ways we could fetch data inside of Next.js, and all within the fetch function. But you need to be careful when you use the fetch, because Next.js does cache a lot, and this is something you need to be really aware of. Let's just go ahead and use that in our application. Let's just use fetch to fetch these recipes. So now in our app, we have recipes that are coming from a array. We don't need this. What we can do is we can just create a local state, call this recipes, set recipes. Once we do get the data from the API, we can set the recipes. So for that, let's just use a lifecycle hook called useEffect. We want this hook to only run the first time. That means we need to give it an empty array. So we're going to say that, hey, let's just use fetch. So we can just say, again, we cannot call a async function directly inside of a useEffect. So what we could do is we could just say get recipes and make this an async function. And let's just say response. And let's just say fetch, and then here call the recipes. And then now again, let's just get the data. So we can just say await response.json. And this gives us the response.json data itself. And now, if there is data, then we can just set the recipes. Now, we just call get recipes right here outside in the function. This way we can call it inside useEffect. Now, keep this in mind. We don't need these recipes anymore. We can just directly call them. Let's just set the recipes and set it with data. So now let's just refresh the page, and you can see that we do have an error. The recipes.map is not a function. So let's just see what happens. So for example, we can just console log data. And if we open up browser developer tools and go to console, then we have an object, and data has recipes as an array. So what we need to do is we can just say recipes. So if that's the case, then let's just call data.recipes. And now if everything works as expected, then we should see a list of cards with all the data. Isn't that amazing? So we have our list of cards ready to go. And obviously this card does not look like the card that we want because it does not have an image. Now here, where we had the placeholder for image inside of our header, let's just add an image. So we can say image source and recipe.image, and then an alt tag. We can just say recipe.name. Width is going to be 500. Height is going to be 500. And let's just make it a background cover, rounded. And then let's just also give it a shadow. And these are all different Tailwind utilities, but makes it a background cover, makes the corner rounded, and also adds some shadow. So now if we do that, oh my God, look at that. Our application looks exactly what we want. It almost looked like the application that we are trying to build here, which is awesome. So this app is already looking pretty good. So now we have all our images from our application right away. So now this looks pretty great, and this is how you could fetch data inside of React plus Vite. But if you're already familiar with how data fetching works in React, then it's exactly that. But now let's say we want to fetch data inside of Next.js, then how would we do the same? Well, if you want to fetch data inside of Next.js, then again we would do the exact same thing. So what we are going to do is we are literally going to copy all of this because everything stays the same. There's nothing in here that should not be in the other page. So if we go back here, we should just basically replace the whole thing. Now, If you take a look, we get an error saying that you are importing a component that needs use effect. This means it only works in a client component and none of its parent are marked with use client, so they are server components by default. So this just brings to the next topic, which is client and server components, which we will talk about in a second, but let's just fix this error for now. So now we're just gonna call this a client component. And by calling this a client component, we're basically saying that, hey, just do perform the fetch in the browser itself. So now if we do that, you can see that literally Next.js also has the same code and everything works as expected, which is what we want. So you might wonder, well, why did we add that client again? Well, let's take a look at that next. So let's talk about client and server components. Well, remember we had to add the use client on top to fix it. But let's talk about what that is to begin with. So for example, in Next.js, by default with the app router, remember I said that a lot of things change with app router. This is exactly it. With app router, we get new client and server components. And as of this point, it's only available inside of Next.js. With client components, what happens is when a browser requests data for asking to fetch the data, what we typically do is make an API request. And that's exactly what we're doing, right? We're basically calling the recipes API, and then the server is going to do the work and it's going to return the data, the recipe data. And then we're going to display that on the page, which is our client on the browser. This is fine with client components. This is exactly what we did just now. But by default in Next.js, all the components are server components. So if you want to say that, hey, this needs to be on the client, then we need to make it a client component. And that's why we had to add the use client directive, which is what we did here, the use client directive inside our components, inside our page. So what exactly are server components then? Well, what happens in a server component is whenever the browser, that is the client, asks to fetch data, we now have the ability to make those components themselves as server components. What this means is we can just say that, hey, if this is a server component, instead of browser doing the work of calling the API, fetching the data, and so on, whenever we make an API request, we make a call to the server. The server then returns it back to the browser, and the browser then parses the data and shows it onto the page. But unless there's an actual need for a browser, that means we are basically calling the window API, or we are calling something that specifically needs a browser, and we don't need a browser at all. We can just make it a server. And that's where server components were born. We could just make components as server components. This means the server is going to handle everything. This means we can make our backend calls on the server itself, and then it will get returned, not in the form of JSON, but in the form of a special stream, and then the browser is just going to show it onto the page to the user. That's where server components are born. When would you make components as client components? Well, let's say you do need a browser, then you would make them as client components. Now in Next.js, there is a really good post. When should you use server versus client components? Well, if you are fetching data, accessing backend resources, keeping sensitive information, keeping large dependencies, and all of that can be on the server. But let's say you have on-click handlers, on-change handlers, you're using any of the React lifecycle hooks such as useState, useEffect, and so on, and you're using browser-specific APIs such as the window object, or you want to get users' location, then all of this can only happen on the browser, and that is when you need to make it a client component. Otherwise, by default, everything else is just going to be a server component. So this is why, in our case, we decided to make it a client component, which we'll get to in a second. But one of the other pros of server components are that you don't need to create a brand new API, because everything is within the component. So you can just call the backend API, whatever data response that you get back, you show it onto the component. So you can call the backend in the same component. And now your client bundle is going to be really small because there's less stuff to download. for the browser because the server is performing majority of the operations. And this is why you get a performance boost as well with server components, which is pretty amazing. If you were to take a look at a component, do we want to use client? Not really. Even though we definitely use state because we just copy pasted the code from our client, from our Vite plus React application, we could just get rid of this. And what we could do is pretty much extract this function out, keep it here, get rid of this also. And instead of set recipes, we can just return data.recipes. Now, what we can do here is we can just directly call, because this is a server component now, because we don't have the use client directive. So we can just say recipes is going to be await get recipes. And this means we need to make this a async function. Now everything should work as expected because there is no client functionality at all. So this is the beauty of using a server component. So now if everything works as expected, our application should perform as it should. Look at that. Now we have our application identical, but the difference is that this is going to be way faster than our Vite plus React application because the server is doing a lot for us. But let's say you do want to make it a client component, then you definitely need to add the directive on top called use client. But in our case, we don't need to worry about it because we don't need to add it. Now let's implement filtering. So for example, the minute we click on Asian or American or any of these different amazing cuisines, we want to make sure that the cards also filter accordingly. When we click on American, only American dishes show up. When we click on Italian, only Italian, Indian, then only Indian, and so on. But the minute we click on all, then we want all the cuisines to show up, or the recipes to show up. That's exactly what we want to implement here. But in a React application, the way we would implement that is by, again, making sure that we are creating some sort of a filter, storing the state of the batch somewhere. And the minute we click on that, we want to store the state of the batch and basically check the entire list of array and filter by the cuisine itself. So for example, here we have a cuisine every time there's a property for that. So we could just filter accordingly. So the way we would implement that in React is very similar to what we have for get recipe. Now, instead of get recipes and set recipes, let's add another state called as filter recipes and set filter recipes. Again, it can be empty. And now what we want is, let's also create another state for badge and set badge. Now here, again, we can just say use state, and by default, it's just going to be all. So now what we could do is we can say that whenever a user clicks on badge, so we can just add a on click handler here, and we can just say handle on click, and let's also pass in the event, and also the cuisine that we have selected. So here again, we can add another handler called handle on click, which is event and cuisine. And here again, cuisine is going to be a string, and then event is going to be react.change event with HTML input element. This is the event. Now we want to make sure that whenever a user does select on the batch, the page does not refresh, so we can just add prevent default. At the same time, now we can just set the batch to be whatever the user selects. Now at the same time, let's just make sure by default is just empty, and then as the user selects the batch, we can enable it. Now what we want to do is we want to set filter recipes whenever the user selects the batch. So for that, we definitely need to repurpose the specific function and use a filter function to filter the elements. So what we could do is we could just create a new function altogether here, and we can just call this get all recipes and just paste it and then return data.recipes here. Make this an async function, and now instead of, we can just say recipes is going to be get all recipes, and then let's just await it here. Now if there are recipes, then we can just set the recipes. So everything should work as expected. But now this enables us to use it inside another function, because whenever the user has selected a batch, we need to do the same. So let's just add another use effect and say that, hey, if there is a badge, then add the code for it. But we need to also make sure that we are closing the use effect and only enabling this use effect only should trigger whenever there is a badge. So we can just say, if there is a badge, then get the filtered recipes. So we can just say get filtered recipes. Now the filtered recipes again is going to be a function, which is going to be a async function. Now here we can just call recipes, and since we are already checking for badge, we can just say if recipes.filter recipe, if the recipe.cuisine is equal to badge, then we want to set this. But let's just make sure we have filtered recipes by cuisine here. And now we only want this when I set this whenever there are filtered recipes by cuisine. So now that we have this, we need to make one more tweak. Right now we are only mapping through recipes but not through filter recipes. So what we can say is if filter, let's just make sure the name filter recipes. If filter recipes dot length is greater than 0, then show filter recipes else recipes. This way we are mapping through filter recipes if there is a filter, else we're just going to return the recipes itself. So let's just make sure we enclose this so that we are able to map it. And now if we click on Mediterranean, then look at that. We do have the filter working as well as all recipes as intended. And these recipes are definitely mouth-watering. So I'm definitely feeling a little hungry right now. All right, now we have filter implemented too. So let's just go ahead and add the type for recipes. So I've already added the type for recipe type. So let's just go ahead and assign it wherever necessary. So here you're gonna have recipe type. IDX is just gonna be number. Similarly, we have recipe type here, so we can easily access it, and that's it. So this is how you can implement filter inside of React with Vite. Now we want to do the same thing in Next.js. So let's see how we can do that. Now things change a little bit inside of Next.js. Remember we talked about client and server components, how specific components need to be a client component whenever we need some interactivity. So in this case, we definitely need interactivity. Whenever we click on any of these items, for example, then it is interactivity that we need in our TastyNext app. So what we could do is, but if we make the entire component as client component, then we will lose the benefit of performance. What we could do is we could extract this batch component and keep the interactivity limited to that. This way we can pass around props and make sure everything works as expected. So let's just copy this, and inside of our UI, let's just create a batch filter component. Again, we can just say it's going to be called batch filter. Let's just paste what we copied. Let's just also grab the cuisines here. So now let's just import batch as well, and we need a on-click handler. So let's just copy that too. So now we can just paste what we copied, and we also need a set badge, and set badge, which is going to be a use state, and then it's going to be empty. But again, we need to make this a client component. Alrighty. So now we have this going. So what we could do is inside of our application, inside of our page, instead of calling cuisines here, we could just say batch filter. And that's it. Now this way we can get rid of this cuisines as well. This way we can definitely have a client component as a child of a server component. So this works as expected. Now how can we make sure that from the batch filter, when we do set the badge, is the specific badge value is what gets shared externally, so that we are able to then filter our page and show, and basically also so that we're able to filter the page and show that page accordingly as well. So for that, what we can do is we need to also extract this code out into its own component. This way this file can still stay a server component. You get rid of this too. Let's create a recipe list component. So if we say recipe list.tsx, again this is going to be a React functional component. Say recipe list, and now paste it what we copied. We don't need this additional div, but we also need to just take in whatever import we have here. Paste it. Just paste it, and now here we'll have recipe list. The recipe list can be a client component if we like, for example, but we need to set the recipes as well. We need to make sure that recipes, this specific recipe is what gets passed in here. So we can just say recipes equals recipe, just like that. So we need to take in recipes as a prop. So we can say recipes is going to be array of recipe type. Recipe type is something we need. So what we can do is just copy paste recipe over here. So we can just say the type is going to be recipe type. So now we have the recipe, and then we can just say this is going to be recipe type, and this is going to be number as well. So now here we just need to assign recipes is going to be this value. All right, so now we have this. We're still making this a server component and passing the data as prop here. But whenever there is a filter, for example, we also need to pass that too. Like we need to make sure that we are able to get that information as well. So let's just make sure everything works as expected. So now if we refresh the page, we click on any filter, it doesn't work for now, but we definitely want everything else. Now, in order for us to make sure that batch filter, when it does set the value, it's setting in a global place where anyone can access it, so that eventually we could just filter the recipes as we want. Now that's not the case anymore. Right now we're just getting the recipes from the API and just mapping through it. We also need to map through filter recipes. And for that, then we need a reducer and a context to set the badge as well as to get the badge value as well. We can filter it. So let's just go ahead and create a context value. So here we can say recipe context.tsx. And if we just create a reducer here, again, the name is going to be selected zine. Typo here. And now the initial state is going to be state, and then selected cuisine is going to be empty. Similarly, if we create a type for initial state, it's just gonna be, let's just say state, it's just gonna be state. Selected cuisine is a string. Perfect. So now the state can be assigned to here. Let's just move it on top. Perfect. So now we also need a action type here. So we can just say type is action type. Again, type is going to be string and payload can be, and we don't need to default export it. In fact, it doesn't need to export at all. So we can just say recipe reducer. So what we ideally want is whenever we dispatch an action for selected cuisine, then the selected cuisine does get set. So we can just say selected cuisine is gonna be payload dot selected cuisine. Beautiful. So now that we have a basic reducer ready to go, now what we want is a provider for context. So we can just say recipe provider, and this can just take children as a prop, and children would be react dot react node. Now we can just return it. Now this is just typical way of creating context, so I'm going really fast. But if we just say recipe context dot provider and then render the children here. Now we also need to make sure that we are getting state and dispatch from use reducer, which it naturally exports. And here we can just initialize reducer and add initial state here. Now here's the thing, we don't have recipe context yet, so we need to create it. So we can just say this needs to be exported. So we can just say recipe context will be create context from React, and then this could be the initial state itself. Perfect. So now the state, or I guess I should say the value, will be state comma dispatch, and instead of state it was going to be cuisine, and we can just directly access it here. Alrighty, so now let's just go ahead and initialize it or declare it here. So now layout is a central spot where everyone, the entire application can access everything. So we would be creating recipe provider. We would declare recipe provider here and wrap our entire application with it. So we can just say this. So recipe provider is in fact imported from context, which is what we want. Now that we have this, let's just go to batch filter, and instead of setting the badge, we're just gonna get dispatch from use context and then recipe context. And now what we're gonna do is we're just gonna dispatch it. So we're gonna say dispatch, and then the type is gonna be what we just defined here, and then we're gonna have a payload. Now we said payload dot selected cuisine, so we need to define it. Selected cuisine is gonna be cuisine. Alrighty, now we have set it. Now it's time for us to use it here. So right now we just get the recipes from the API and declare it, but what we need to do is get just filter the recipes here and paste it here too. So we can just paste it and let's just get the use effect as well. We don't need recipes because we get that already from the API. And instead of badge this time, it's going to be the context that we want. So you're gonna copy this line, add it here, import everything as needed, use state, and then state will have the cuisine value, the selected cuisine value. So we can just add that here. And then we also need the use state, the state value of filtered recipes here. Again, let's import this too. Now we don't have badge, but we do have selected cuisine. So let's update that. Similarly, let's just update the dependencies as needed. Now this is just going to be recipe type array. Perfect. So now we have this. We need to add the same condition that we had here, which is that if we have filtered recipes, then we just need to get it and set it just like that. All right. So now let's just test it out and see what happens. So now it says that you're importing a component that needs create context. So it needs to be a client component. So here we need to make this a client component, but because of the children pattern that we are using here, only this component will be client component. All right. So now if I click on Mexican, look at that. Everything works as expected and we are able to filter the way we would want it to. So this is how filtering would work, and this is how you could basically pull out the value and store it in a global place as well. So now speaking of data fetching, as we implemented context, you can see over here with fetch, this specific fetch function is special because by default it has an additional property of cache, which is not something that's available in the React Vite world. This is something that's over here. So by default it's in fact force cache. But let's say I don't want it to cache, then I could pick the other options as well. So this fetch function is definitely the special function that we talked about. Now let's go ahead and build the individual recipe page. All this recipe page does is that displays more details about the API. And when you click on back to all recipes, then it goes back to how it was. Now, whenever you click on any of the individual cards is when we route. So again, back in React, what we could do is on the home page for card, in order for us to link between pages, we can just say href and then close the entire card with a link. And this time we can just say, just go to recipe / and we can say recipe.id. Now this way we are linking between pages. So home page card can go to recipe page, for example. So if we go here and click on classic margarita pizza, we do get taken back. Any of these cards should take us back accordingly. But this is recipe 1, this is recipe 2 in the URL, and 3, and so on. So which is what we want. So now let's just go ahead and build the recipe page further. Now in order for us to build the individual recipe page, we just need to get the ID from the individual page and accordingly pull it. Now as we talked about earlier, whenever we go to /2, then that gives you the individual recipe itself. And we can use the specific image too. So right now what we can do is we can just pull that. So now in React Router, we can get the ID in the URL by using a function called as useParams. What we can do is we can just get the recipe ID from useParams router. This should give us the recipe ID itself. And now we can just get the individual recipe and display it. So again, the same idea as before. We have the use effect and then we're gonna just set the recipe accordingly. So recipe, set recipe, use state. Now we can just say if there is a recipe ID, then perform the operation of fetching the recipe. Fetch recipe ID. So now here we can just make this an async function. So we can just say fetch recipe async. Now we can just get the recipe. So now what we can do is we can just pretty much copy what we had for getting the recipe. So we can just copy this code, paste it. And now instead of /recipes, we can just make it so that we can just get the recipe ID here. And we don't need to pass it. We can just grab it globally, which we have it here. Now we just directly get the recipes as an object. So we don't need to, this is literally the recipe itself. So what we can do is just say set recipe as data. So this way we get the information as needed. So we can just print data.name if everything works as expected. We can say recipe.name. Now in case there is is no recipe, for example, we can just say, no recipe found. So now if we take a look, we go here, you can see there's classic margarita pizza. Similarly, this should say vegetarian stir fry. It does say that, chocolate chip cookies, and so on. So that means our page is ready to get built. Just like we have a link component inside of Next.js, there's also a link component for React Router DOM that we could utilize. So right now, whenever the app that we're trying to build, it does say back to all recipes. So we can just copy this. And here, instead of relying on something else, we can just use the link component from React Router DOM. And let's just say to, and this can just go back to home, for example. So now if we take a look at the app, go back here, it does take us back to home as intended, which is what we want. But obviously there's more that we display on the page here. So as usual, I'm going to provide the styling for you. So let me just paste the styling for our app. There you go. So all we're doing here is we're getting the recipes, we're printing the names, servings, prep time minutes, and all of that, but also adding the styling with it too. Back to our app, you should see our recipe getting displayed as intended, which is exactly what we want. But you notice how there is like a really nice gradient in our app that does not exist in the app that we have. So let's just add the gradient as well. So inside of Tailwind, when we go to index.css, there are 3 different layers. We have the base layer, then we also have the components layer and the utilities layer. Now, whenever you want to create a custom class name that could be utilized in multiple places, then you could use the different layers according. So if I want to create a custom utility, then I could just use the utilities layer itself. If I want to create a custom Tailwind component, then I could use the layer for components. For now, since I want to create a utilities, this is a way we can extend it. So we can say fancy gradient, and then we can just paste the specific gradient that I have already created for us. This just makes it a radial gradient, and these are the 3 different color stops. So it starts from left, then turns into violet, and then it's orange towards the end. So now if we go back, you can see that we have this beautiful gradient applied. Similarly, because the class name called fancy gradient was already on the card as well, we also got this specific gradient. So our app is looking really, really good. Now, in order for us to implement the same inside Next.js, we need to do something slightly different. We need to use something called as generate static params. Now, what these do is that they return a list of params to populate the dynamic segment. And because in Next.js, we can cache a lot of the data, server-side render it and cache it, because of that, we don't need to necessarily retrieve the data every single time. Because right now what happens in our React app is that every single time the data is retrieved. But we don't need to do that in Next.js. We can just cache it. For that, we need to tell Next.js that, hey, I want you to basically cache all of these params and then keep it in the cache itself, keep it in the cache store. So next time the user accesses it, it's the same cache itself. So what we can do is we can just copy this and head over to Next.js page inside of recipes. And this time we're just gonna paste what we copied. Now here we're just gonna give Next.js all the list of pages that we wanna cache. So Next.js can just cache it. And for that reason, we can just pretty much copy what we had inside of page. So here we have the get recipes function. So we can just extract this function out, and in the lib utils, or I guess let's just create a new lib for recipe, and here let's just add it so anyone can access it from here. So now in our page, let's just import it. Similarly, let's also import it here too. So we can just say recipes are going to be get, say await get recipes. Now we can just map through the recipes, and this can be recipe which will be of type recipe type. And now here, instead of slug, it's going to be recipe ID, because that's what we define here. The dynamic slug segment is going to be recipe ID. So we can just say recipe ID is going to be recipe.id. And we always want to make sure that ID is always a string and not a number. So we need to make it to string. So now this tells Next.js that please generate and cache all these paths in general. Whatever gets generated in this will be accessed at next time. But we still need to access the individual recipe as well over here. So for that, we can just copy what we created in the recipe page here. So now we can literally copy all of this and then paste it inside the page. We don't need a use effect at all here. We can just directly call it, because by default this is a server component. We don't even need React here. We don't need to set the recipe. We do need recipe ID. Now in Next.js we could just access the params here, and then params are going to be, we should say recipe ID, gonna be string. Now params would be just here. Now we don't need any of this, but if there is no recipe, then we can get it. We need to make this an async function, and now we are able to get the recipe itself from our API. And now again, like we did earlier, we can just get recipe.name and add it here. Now if we go to our Next.js app and click on classic margarita pizza, nothing happens because we haven't linked it. So now, just like we did in our React app, let's just go to our page and then link it. So now here in card, we can just add a link component. href is going to be 2 backticks, and then let's get this and move it here. Now all we need here is, we need to move this key on top, and now all we need here is /recipes recipe.id. There you go. So now if we try again, when we click on it, it takes us and it shows us classic margarita pizza, which is exactly what we want. Similarly, it also gives us the vegetarian stir fry name, then we have chocolate chip cookies, and so on. Now just like we did in our recipe page in React, which is what we have here, what we can do is pretty much get the recipe styling that we have and then add it to Next.js too. So we can just get the recipe page and add it here. Now, if everything works as expected, the only thing is we need to import the link component from Next.js here instead of React Router DOM, and this should be href. Alrighty, so now if we go to a classic margarita pizza, we do get the classic margarita pizza we want with all the details. Similarly, if we want vegetarian stir fry, then we do get that as well. Then we have chocolate chip cookies and so on, which is what we want. Now, lastly, let's just also add the gradient that we want as well. Again, similar idea, but the gradient would be slightly different this time. So if we go to index.css, let's just copy this whole thing, go to another file here. It's not index.css here. It's global.css, and all the way to the bottom, let's just tweak it, because we don't want the same colors all over again. Just make this orange. I'll make this 400, and that's it. Let's see now. Well, look at that. Our colors are looking beautiful. And if you click on vegetarian stir fry, then it also changes the background of this too, which looks really good. I'm very happy with how the app has come along so far. And alongside that, we're learning so much comparing Vite with React alongside Next.js too, which is pretty awesome. So this is how you would essentially implement caching inside of Next.js, but how it works inside of React plus Vite too. It's pretty much typical React app that we are building for React plus Vite, but the difference is that inside of Next.js, we can basically cache all these. So how exactly should you get started with React? Should you go with the framework, or should you go with React plus Vite? Well, here's the thing. As a beginner React dev, it's really important for you to focus on React and Vite, and here's why. Even though frameworks do provide a lot, even though the React docs recommend the use of framework, it's really important that you understand what goes behind the scenes as well. Because if you were to get stuck while fetching data, you can already see that Next.js caches a lot by default. So you may not know how to purge the cache or the fact that it's happening to begin with. So this is why it's really important that you start with React plus Vite, because you don't get any specific caching. There's not a lot done for you, so you get to pick what you want. Now, React as a beginner dev is already complex enough. There are too many topics such as React lifecycle hooks, how to update state, how to avoid re-rendering, how does re-rendering work, and so on. So React in itself is definitely a beast that you really need to master before you get involved with other frameworks like Next.js or Remix or anything of that sort. That's why I would highly recommend you to go with React plus Vite, and that's why this specific crash course was provided, so that you get a really good understanding that, hey, how does life look like with React plus Vite, and what does that compare to using a framework as well. So even though Next.js is great, as a beginner React dev, it might really trip you up because Next.js by default caches a lot. So if data does go stale, fail and if you're not sure how to purge that cache, then you're gonna get really confused as a beginner dev. You may not even think it's the framework that's doing it. You may think that it's your own mistake, which may be true too. But again, it's really important that you start with React plus Vite, and then as you get more familiar with React and how it works, then start adding a framework and use a framework. But if you were to get started with a production application, obviously it depends on your needs. If you get a chance to start on a brand new project where you are among the few developers that are starting that specific project, then I would highly recommend you to take a look at the pros and cons of framework as well as React plus Vite and just see how the two compare with each other. Also look into deployment options for how it looks like, and you want to maybe evaluate that as a cloud platform as well for a specific company. So there's obviously a lot that goes to make sure that your application can scale when and so on. So this is why this course was provided to help guide you so that even if you are getting started or not, you can sort of compare what the world looks like with React plus Vite and alongside a powerful framework like Next. Now let's talk about performance. Now React plus Vite by default doesn't have much when it comes to performance. Yes, we can optimize the React re-rendering and make sure that the client-side rendering is really fast and so on, but out of the box there's nothing that it provides. If you were to use Next.js, then just like the link component that we saw earlier, which extends the HTML anchor element, there's also a image component that Next.js provides you. Based on the user's viewport, Next.js image component is only going to download the image sites necessary for your viewport. For example, if we go to the Next.js app that we have over here, and let's just view all the images. So now let's just head over to the Next.js app and let's go to the browser developer tools, and right now we are on mobile. This cache, and now if I empty cache and hard reload, let's see what the image size is of this one. It's now 127 kilobytes. But now let's say I clear this and switch to mobile, for example, on a smaller device, and let's clear this and let's just see empty cache and hard reload and see what happens. Now this same image is now 83 kilobytes. Now you can already see how the image component is performing really well here. On a smaller device, we don't need a huge image, and these kilobytes are going to add up. So that is why it's really important that we use the Next.js image component, because it gives us a lot of performance benefit out of the box. Now you may want to check out all the different properties that Next.js has and to configure your image. So how about we just go ahead and do the same in our image here. So now let's just go to our image. So like we can go to recipe list, and inside that there's the card component. We have the image, and this is why the prompt was that you need to use the image component. Here we can just use the image component from next image, and that's it. That's all we need to do. So now as we do that, it does say that we need to configure the domain, and if we click on this specific URL, we can just pretty much copy what we have here, and we need to add cdn.dummyjson.com. So if we go to next config here, let's just add cdn.dummyjson.com, and we just need it on all ports. Now let's refresh the page and see what happens. Let's see. So now you can see that the image still appears, but now it uses a performant Next.js image, which means we are going to get a lot of performance benefits out of the box, which means that we are going to basically download a smaller image based on user's viewport, and as a result our app is really performant. Now there's a lot you can do with image component in general, but I just wanted to give you an overview of how there are specific components in a framework that make your app really performant out of the box, but just by the fact that you're using them. Let's talk about fonts now. So speaking of performance, when you were to use fonts inside of React plus Vite, we just have to mainly just import it in our HTML file, and that's pretty much. We don't get any font optimization out of the box. But let's say we want to optimize our fonts in general, then Next.js does offer us a font package that will allow you to optimize any fonts and remove any external requests in general. So what they do is that they again download our font files and our CSS file just like our additional assets that we have, and download them at build time, and they are self-hosting the rest of the static assets just like that. So if we were to use Google Fonts, which again we can just use the Google Fonts using the same package, it's really easy. You don't need to import a new link from Google Fonts or download a package. It's all available out of the box, and also no requests are sent to Google as well, so we could just directly use Google Fonts in general. So because the font files are downloaded and and then cached, and then we can access it whenever our application gets really fast. Now, one of the reasons why your application, the fonts can have a significant impact on your application. If you download a really heavy font, it might really slow down your application and really cost you performance. So that's why this Next font package is really useful. In order for us to use fonts and apply fonts in our app, for example, in the React Vite, we want the header to be a specific font. We also want the rest of our page to be a specific font too. So what we're going to do is we're just going to head to Google Fonts. We're going to select two fonts. We're going to select the Lolita 1 font, and also we're going to select the Montserrat font. All we need to do is just copy this code, head over to our React file and go to index.html and just add it in our head element. This would mean that our two fonts are downloaded, Montserrat as well as Lolita. Now, if we head over to our app and go to our network tab and we look for Google font, you can see that Lolita 1 and Montserrat have been applied as well. But now they are not necessarily applied to the elements themselves. And for that, what we're going to do is we're going to head to index.css, and here we are mainly just going to paste what I have here. We're just going to paste all the font families that we have. So we're applying H1 to Montserrat, and so on. We can just tweak this and say H1 is gonna get Lolita 1. That's the font we have downloaded, and now you can see Lolita 1 is in fact a really cool font, and then the rest of the fonts, Montserrat has been applied to the rest of the fonts. So for example, if I inspect element, select the specific title, then it's Montserrat, whereas this one is Lolita 1. So that's how you can just apply fonts in React plus Vite. You want to do the same thing inside of Next, then what we can do is again use the Next font package. Now, Next font is already available as an import. So instead of inter font, which gets applied by default when you bootstrap your Next.js app, then here we can just get Lolita 1 and Montserrat. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to say Montserrat is going to be default and just keep it as is and add the weight necessary too. So we can just get different weights that we want. So you want 500, 600, 700. Similarly, if we want Lolita as well, then we can just get Lolita font 2. So we can just say, again, gonna be Latin, and then we're just gonna say weight is gonna be, it only has one weight, so it's just gonna get 400. So now alongside inter, what we could do is we can just apply inter as a class name, and then we can also apply Lolita as a class name too. So this is how we can apply multiple fonts as well. But again, it's not gonna work until we apply it here too. So again, we're just gonna do the same copy pasting over here. We're just gonna say Lolita 1 for H1. The minute we do that, if you head over to our Next.js app, you can see how the different fonts have changed. This one should be Lolita 1, and then even these ones have Lolita 1 for some reason, so we can fix that. Or we can keep it as is, it doesn't matter. But for example, you can see how Montserrat has been applied to the rest of the text on the page. So this is how you can apply fonts in Next.js and how simple it is. Now you can do whatever you want. The difference is that with React plus Vite, we did not get any performance benefits, versus with Next.js, these fonts are going to get bundled and available at build time, and they are basically going to be cached and not re-downloaded every single time from Google, which is what we want. So this gives you a really huge performance. So now let's talk about search engine optimization and SEO. Now, the way SEO works is that, let's say on Google, I type best mushroom lamb, or I basically just type best recipes or best chicken recipes and so on. Then our site should be available on Google. Otherwise, it's not going to get discovered unless you share the direct URL to your friends. Let's say we look for best mushroom lamb. We have 3 different results: orange lamb, CB2 mushroom lamb, and a post on top 5 mushroom lamb. Now, the reason why these 3 things showed up on Google is because they are following a specific criteria that's necessary, due to which Google have ranked them higher. Now, in order for you to learn about SEO in general, this is a really good guide on developers.google.com, which is amazing, that you should check out on how Google search works. But give you a really quick summary, we need to have a few different criteria to make sure that we get more points by Google, by the different search engine bots that Google sends out to basically parse parse our site and check out what's on our site. One is the description of the site. So for example, whenever we go to any site, we should have a really good description. So let's say we go to my website, and if we go to the network tab, right now in the head element, I have a title of my website, which is my website. But then I also have a description here, which is tutorials for developers and engineering leaders. And this is what I focus on. I have an OG image. I have a URL. I have a image alt tag. I have some Twitter information and so on. Now, all of this is really important when it comes to configuring your site for SEO. Description is important, what this site is all about, what's the title of the site, what's a canonical URL, that is what is the true URL of that specific site. Am I following any semantics? So if it's necessary, then for example, this specific value should be h1 because this is very important. But this is, for example, p tag. Honestly, this could be h2 and so on. But like for example, this one is h2 because this is really important title on my website, and this necessarily needs to be h3 because again, this is really important on my website. Now, all of this is really important, and this specific hierarchy is what Google looks at when it tries to parse your website. And there's a lot more that goes in SEO, but these are a few things we need to definitely take a look at when it comes to SEO. Now, an application should allow us to easily update this information. Unfortunately, in React and Vite world, it's not as straightforward. If we were to update the description and add any of the meta tags on the homepage, then we could add that over here. For example, we could change this title to TastyReact, and this is good. In order for us to add the description, we can add the description here and then any of the meta tags in general, configure our site further. But let's say I want to do the same dynamically for like the recipe page. There is no API that's available out of the box to do that. And this is where a package like React Helmet is very useful, where you could basically update it, and you can see already it has so many downloads, where you can update the meta tags in your site and dynamically generate them. This is great, but it's not available out of the box. Versus inside of Next.js, there is a specific API called as the metadata API. Now, anytime you wanna expose the title and description, you can easily do that with the metadata API. In fact, if you go into layout, it's already exposed here. So if I want to change the description, all I need to do is update this TastyNext. And if I want to say whatever description I want, curated recipes based on 10 plus different cuisines such as Indian, American, Asian, and more, something like that, then in that case, now this gives a really good description for my site. Now let's say if I want to update the URL in metadata API, I could easily do that by looking at the documentation, for instance. But at the same time, if I want to update dynamic metadata, then there is a function, just like we have the function for generate static params, there is a function for generate metadata, and we can update open graph images, we can update different information and so on. Now this is all really straightforward inside of Next.js because it gives us really additional capabilities for doing that. But in order for us to do the same thing in React and Vite, we might have to install a package called React Helmet, and there are more that I haven't really discovered yet. But SEO is something that should be top of mind, and Next.js does make it a lot easier for you, or frameworks in general will make it a lot easier for you to do that because they do think about all of this in mind. Now, first load of your website is also really important for SEO. So as we have seen earlier, whenever we look, let's say we disable JavaScript in this specific app, we have done this before, but if we do that again and disable JavaScript, refresh the site, we get a blank page. Versus if you were to do the same thing inside of Next.js, go to sources, disable JavaScript and refresh the page, we still have a fully functional site. So when bots look for it, they are going to get all the information necessary. We have a fully functional site. We don't necessarily need JavaScript. That means there's minimal JavaScript that needs to be downloaded. And because we're following semantics, our site is going to rank higher. So this is why using a framework that focuses on pre-rendering and gives you that server rendering is really important versus something like React plus Vite. So using something like Vite that will give you that server rendering capability is really, really important as well. So definitely keep that in mind when you make a choice for what you want to use in your app. So now before we wrap up, let's just make TypeScript happy and make sure that we're not making any mistakes while initializing state or anything of that sort. So one, for recipe context, we added payload as any, but we do know the payload now. We know that payload is going to have selected cuisine because that's exactly what we are setting over here payload.selectedCuisine. So let's just make sure we have that specific payload. And then it does say that state has no properties in common with type. So as we decide to assign selected cuisine directly, we also can just tweak this area. So we don't need an additional property called state. We can just make it by default as state. Now, recipe context does not know what the initial state value should be or the type should be. So let's just fix that. So we can just say it's going to have two values. One is going to be the state, which is going to be just state. And then the other value is going to be a dispatch function, which is going to be react.dispatch. And then we're just going to take an action type here. Now the initial state can probably have dispatch function as well, which is going to be null. Whoops, not here, but here. Now this can be optional too. Text will be initialized with state as initial state, and then dispatch is just going to be null. So now this way we have made TypeScript happy because we have added the necessary types for everything. Now if we head to batch filter, it should be a mouse event instead of a change event. So let's just fix that too. So we can just say mouse event, HTML div element, and then mouse event. Alrighty. So now in order for us to make sure that everything works as expected, let's go ahead and run a production build. Now we have an additional command called build that will help us run a build for production. So it will bundle all our files together and let us know if there are any errors as well. So now here, let's just go ahead and run npm run build. Now the minute we do that, it's going to create a production build, compile all the files, and now it has given us an warning saying that image should result in slower LCP, the higher bandwidth, consider using an image component. So we forgot to change, after copy pasting the recipe itself, the image component. For example, here, we don't need to use image. We can just use the image component from Next.js. And here, let's just add recipe.name. So now if we run the build again, let's see what happens. It's generating our static pages and collecting all the page data. And now you can essentially see that we have essentially cached recipe 1, 2, 3 and 27 more paths. So whenever we essentially run npm run start, then our experience is going to be a lot faster for our users as well. And this is because we have essentially used generate static params as we created here. And this just basically caches all the recipes that we have from the API. So now we can just run npm run start just to make sure everything works as expected. So now we can just go to localhost 3000 and make sure everything works as expected. Alrighty, so our application loaded really fast. And if you click on any of the information, then it works as expected. Then we have filtering working as well on different cuisines. And you can see how quick the application load is. The initial load of our application is really important, so this is really good. Now, if we were to do the same thing with React, let's say we were to run a npm run build, which runs the build for React. We have quite a few errors here, so let's just fix that too. So if we go to React, you can see here we have these red squiggly lines. It says that property name does not exist on type. So what we need to do is when we created state, we can just add a type here called as recipe type, so that we are telling the Vite build that, hey, we know this type and this does exist with all these different properties. Now, if you go to home page, and if you take a look at e tag, again, we can use the mouse event itself. So here we can just say React dot mouse event. Whoops. And then just paste that. Similarly, let's just copy this and paste the same over here as well. Alrighty, so now we have this. Let's also delete this code because we don't need it. Importing React, but we're not using it anywhere. So for that, let's just get rid of it. In the home page, do we have it? No. In the nav bar, we do have it. Let's get rid of that too. We had it in nav bar, we have it in recipe page. Now let's run a build again. So it's building for production, and it has essentially built for production, which is pretty amazing. Just go ahead and start our site, and we have a preview command that we can use to start the site. So let's do that. So now the page load was also quite instant. If you click on it, then it's going to load the API data. And then if I go back to all recipes, we can filter everything as well as expected, as intended. So our application is looking pretty good. But keep this in mind, API calls are being made to get all the recipes and then individual recipes too. So for example, if I refresh the page, you can see an API call is being made. Versus inside of Next.js, if I go to the network tab, you can see that this is the React Server component description file that I talked about, which is a very different looking file than a JSON file. It is not JSON, but that's what it uses to essentially get the description of the page and generate all the pages. Alrighty, so this is how you set up an application in React plus Vite versus Next.js. I really hope you enjoyed this specific course. Thank you so much for checking out this specific crash course. As next steps, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel at Kulkarni and Kida, because I really focus on tutorials and different crash courses and different things that help you level up as a developer in your career, as well as if you're into engineering leadership, then I have some stuff for that too. At the same time, if you are interested in learning Next.js further, then I also am running a Next.js workshop that you should just check out at nextjsworkshop.dev to sign up, and you may get some launch discounts as you watch a specific free code camp video. So thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.